of that?
It's been a terrible century, of course. Most of the time, there's been so much trouble in the world. I don't think that people can be very proud of the century, although a time of much accomplishment. Um, One supposes that the dramatic event of the 11th of September uh, was kind of a denouement of a repetition of earlier disasters that were so many we might have expected that something like that was going to happen, because in attacking the World Trade Center, which was the largest building that ever was put up in New York City, the very center of our wealth, um, we might have expected a whiplash against um, not American power so much as just a resentment against the kind of power that was built into what we call civilization, that had angered people outside the orbit of it all, so that they felt they had to do something really ultra dramatic to paralyze it. Um, Now there are too many ideas there to try to parse it all
Yeah.
out. But
I mean, maybe we should talk more about before that, but I was just interested in what you had to say. I'm just going to take your glasses so they don't get click, click,
thank
clicking.
you,
Thank you.
thank you.
And so you wanna can we talk about why you left the church and went to the war? Like, why did you go to the
Oh,
army?
well, uh, it it'll take a minute.
Oh, it can take as long as you want.
The uh, I made a trip to Europe in 1933, arriving there in May. Uh, Adolf Hitler had only been in power for about 4 months then, and having lived through World War I as a child, but very much absorbed by the drama of the war, um, I'd always uh, felt sorry for the Germans because they were beaten, and uh, life had been very hard for the Germans. And the German friends that I knew were depressed about their own country, and angry because they felt that food had been withheld from them, and work was scarce, and life was hard. And so when I got to Germany in 1933 and saw these brown shirts and their trim uniforms, and the people rather jubilant because life in Germany had picked up, I felt rather a sense of sympathy towards this new movement that had come in and given spirit to the German people. And I came back to the United States and went to my first parish in Providence, Rhode Island. And there, as I saw some German refugees coming into Providence, I began to see a different picture. One of them was a notable lecturer at a university who was being expelled from Germany because he had an ancestor who was Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, the great composer. And he'd been voted the most popular lecturer at the University of Leipzig. And here he was. He was been cast out from Germany. And I met others who told me stories about the ill treatment the Nazis were given to certain elements, mainly Jewish, of course, in the population. And this was just sickening to hear about. I had another friend who went to a German professor's house and found him rather sympathetic to the Nazis. And my friend was so disturbed by his attitude that he got up from the dinner table, went out and got into his car, and drove out of Germany, vowing never to return to Germany again. And he.
So you heard all this and.
And I changed my mind about Adolf Hitler completely, and I remember when I went then to a little church in Western Washington, and I found one of the members of my parish, a man who moved to a poor little plot of ground from somewhere in the Middle West, and he had joined a radical group called the White Shirts, which was an effort to create something like Nazism in the United States. And the people who had gotten a hold of him had really seized his mind. He was now very obedient to this whole movement. And so I became an out-and-out supporter of the effort to for America to aid the Allies in their struggle against Germany, especially after war was declared in September of 1939. And when we were hit by the Japanese in Pearl Harbor, I immediately thought that I'd better act on my convictions, and so I made an application to be a chaplain in any of the services. And at first I thought it was going to be the Navy, but it was the Army that finally came through and asked me to join them, so that I did. And I've never regretted my decision one bit, nor changed my mind about the absolute necessity we had in fighting that war. It was beyond any question necessary to eliminate Hitlerism and all that it stood for.
So, you went there. You enlisted, and what was it like being a chaplain in the Army? Can you tell me some of the experiences or feelings that you had, or some maybe just some things that you think are especially important?
Well, I was sent immediately to the chaplain school, which was located at Harvard University. We took over some of the buildings that belonged to people who were studying law and some sciences, and of course we were it was a period of introducing you to the way the Army looked at things, the certain things like map reading and using compasses and such if you got lost behind lines and that sort of thing, and also a sense of sympathy for people of all faiths in the Army. We were to everyone in the Army was to be ours to serve as completely as we could, which was it was a very good attitude. From there, I went to Fort Mason here in the city of San Francisco, where there was a chapel just being built for the first time. And it was my job to organize a congregation in that chapel, or rather to see to it that the chapel was as fully used as could be. That meant that we had on the staff, as well as myself, a Catholic chaplain who had masses there on Sunday morning. I had a general service for anybody who wished to come, which meant that it did not have the mark of any particular church on it. And then in the evening we had a sort of Baptist service, a very evangelical service, and then also a Christian Science service. So we went as widely as we could. Those were the services that were asked for. Oh, and we had a Jewish service on Friday nights.
Was that unique?
No, well, it was the only one we had in the Army in the city at that time. We had a wonderful man from the Navy Hospital across the bay who came over.
But was that unique for you to be sort of, it was kind of almost like an interfaith experience?
It was, yes.
Can you say that in your own words?
Well, yes. The interfaith movement, it was always a rather weak affair in America until recently. I would say that much of its present strength comes from the attitude of people who were in the military services of our country, because it was understood that interfaith was something that we all shared in common, in that we were neighbors one of another and were living together, and that religious experience was common to us all. I think that we must thank the military services. This is one of the many things that people forget about when they think about what the military services have done for our country. They've not only protected us and kept us safe from our foes, but they've tended to build a further strength of unity amongst us all through the common life that anybody has experienced who's been in the military.
Okay, so after you were at the chapel, then you went to Europe?
Yes. First, however, because Fort Mason was the port of embarkation for troops going overseas into the Pacific War. And it was more than that, because it was the highest headquarters for 4 subports along the Pacific coast: Seattle, San Diego, Los Angeles, and then San Francisco. all the supplies, all the men who went out. The sending was handled at Fort Mason, and this was a huge job in the war against Japan. And while I was at Fort Mason, the commanding officer, General Frederick Gilbreth, kindly allowed me to go on 2 transport voyages down into the South Pacific. So I saw a little bit of that war, as well as the war in Europe, which came later. It was on this, after the second of those voyages, upon return, in which we brought back a great many of the sailors of the United States ship, the Helena, which had been sunk at the Battle of the Kula Gulf, that I found that there were orders waiting for me to go to Europe. I was delighted when I heard this, because I wanted a more active sort of work as a chaplain, doing the things that I thought chaplains did, rather than here in the city of San Francisco at the big headquarters at Fort Mason.
So then you went to Europe.
Yes. Went on, we were at war, of course, with Germany and Italy. And there were 90 of us chaplains who were assembled at Fort Hamilton, New York, who got on board an Italian ship which carried us across the Atlantic Ocean to Liverpool, England. It was an Italian ship because when the King of Italy fired Mussolini, the ship immediately left Trieste at the northern end of the Adriatic Sea and began sailing down into the Mediterranean in order to place themselves in Allied hands. And the Allies took this ship and refitted it to carry troops from America to Europe. We had an Italian crew on board. It was quite an unusual feeling at that time. It all worked very well. And then I was briefly stationed in England, very briefly. I think 10 days later, I got an order to proceed to France. And we flew from the Biggin Hill airport, a strictly military one, over to Isigny in France on the Normandy coast. This was the 15th of August. It was a little more than 2 months after our landings on D-Day. And, I recognized as we left the airport and went around a certain church that it was the one at where the famous artwork of Queen Matilda is, about the landing of William of Normandy in England in 1066 is. And it shocked me to see how battered the building was. The windows were broken, and some of the supporting arches had fallen down, and the roof was caved in. And so I saw that I was arriving in a part of the world where war had shaken things up a bit, and we went on to a little town of Perrier, where I was introduced to the adjutant of the outfit I belonged with, and met my colleague, Father Vincent Hines, the Roman Catholic chaplain, and was given a tent in which to sleep. And it was quite a comfortable tent, as a matter of fact. I had a little table in it, and I could sit with my head up in the tent. Most people were in little dog tents that just huddled right on the ground. We were all located in an apple orchard in Normandy, and it was rather primitive, but there was a good sense of fellowship and morale in the place. And it was there that I began picking up glass. I first went into the town of Perrier, which is just alongside of our camp, and walked around the main square with its church in the center. I have a very nice picture, a photograph of that. It was evening time. The lights were fading from the sky, and but there was nobody about. It was you don't understand what it's like to be walking through desolation with no one else there. At least I thought there was no one else there until I saw over in one corner of the square, on top of a ruined house, one lone single man. He was trying to shove blocks out of the way. I don't know whether he was the owner of that house, whether he was trying to uncover things that he needed, or whether there was someone whom he loved who had been killed in this and was still underneath all the rubble. But he looked up and he saw me, and he paused for a minute, and I just had a feeling of hostility on his part. Of course, it wasn't against me personally, but just me as a representative of what war had done to his home. I've never forgotten that, because it was so true of what war does. It's not just a matter of, after a battle, hearing that 8,000 people were lost. They were 8,000 individuals that were important to others, and who had a whole heritage of things that were deeply wrecked by this strange business of humans attacking other humans in as vicious a way as possible in order to gain the day. Gaining the day was very important, however. Well, then we went on. General Bradley, our commander, won a great battle at a place called Saint-Lô. And when the German forces were defeated there, General Patton came on the scene, and he broke through in an area out towards the English Channel, and suddenly his troops had routed the Germans, and they were just proceeding at the most rapid pace across France. And we followed him, our headquarters, which was superior to his headquarters, all the way across France to Paris. We arrived in Paris just a few days after Paris had been liberated by forward elements of General Patton's command, and we were housed in a little, a very grand sort of military camp of the French officers. Father Hines and I were given the officers' club for our residence and place of business. And during that time, I made a couple of trips into Paris and saw the jubilation of the French people and the fact that they had been freed from German rule of 4 years' extent.
And what about Omar Bradley and the top secret Allied command? Can you tell about that experience? Because Paul said you had some very inside connections or something. I don't really know anything about it, and I don't even really know who Omar Bradley was.
Omar Bradley was a very competent infantry general. He knew how important it was to have troops on the ground, able to hold the ground and able to move forward and seize more ground. He had been under General Patton in the war in Africa, but General Eisenhower felt that when we were moving into France after D-Day, that Bradley would be a better man to represent the American forces. So Bradley was named the commander of all the American forces to work with Field Marshal Montgomery of the British forces. The two of them were responsible for the landings in Normandy and the direction of the troops, the English to the east and the Americans to the west. General Montgomery and General Patton were too much alike one another to get along. They but they were both very, very good general officers, and they both, when the breakthrough came, were streaking across the land for the Rhine River. General Montgomery felt that the war would go much better if he was given more in the way of men and supplies to move in the area where he was piercing through the German lines. And General Patton felt that he was a man who understood war better, so he ought to have the preference. Well, it was General Eisenhower's job to try to keep peace between these two headstrong general officers, and General Eisenhower found it very, very difficult to do so. And but it was.
What does that have to do with Omar Bradley and your meeting him or working with him?
During the war, I didn't work with General Bradley. He was much too senior for me. After the war, I